The highest echelons of global finance do not fear market collapse. They anticipate it with the cold, calculated precision of an architect watching a controlled demolition. While the public is conditioned to view economic crashes as chaotic, unforeseen disasters, the historical record suggests a far more unsettling reality: that these moments of systemic failure are the ultimate catalysts for the consolidation of power. Throughout history, from the Medici in Renaissance Florence to the modern-day titans of Wall Street, the most influential actors have operated on a strategy that thrives not on stability, but on the violent transitions between economic regimes. They understand a fundamental truth that the average investor often misses: that true wealth is not created during the boom, but captured during the panic. We are currently standing at the precipice of such a transition, where the signals of a terminal debt cycle are aligning with a deliberate shift in institutional positioning, suggesting that the Great Reset is not a theory, but an active, multi-phase strategy currently in its final stages of execution. To understand the gravity of our current situation, we must recognize that the stakes extend far beyond the valuation of a stock portfolio or the interest rate on a mortgage. We are witnessing a fundamental battle over the future of the global monetary architecture, a transition from a world of unconstrained fiat expansion to a new, highly controlled digital paradigm. This shift matters now because the traditional tools of economic management have reached their mathematical limit. Central banks can no longer print their way out of a crisis without triggering the very hyperinflationary collapse they seek to avoid. Consequently, the elite strategy has shifted from maintenance to liquidation and replacement. The middle class is being positioned as the bag holder for a century of fiscal irresponsibility, while the institutional architects are quietly moving into position to inherit the wreckage. By examining the historical precedents of systemic collapses and the mechanical reality of our current debt-to-GDP ratios, we can begin to see the outline of the playbook being used to navigate the coming storm. The historical rewind takes us back to the early 20th century, specifically to the Panic of 1907 and the subsequent secret meetings at Jekyll Island that birthed the Federal Reserve. This was not merely a response to a banking crisis, but a masterful execution of a strategy to centralize the issuance of currency under a private-public hybrid. By studying the archives of the 1920s and 30s, we see how the roaring decade of credit expansion was followed by a deliberate tightening of the money supply, leading to the Great Depression. During this period, while millions lost their farms and livelihoods, the most connected financial institutions, those with insider access to the shifting tides of liquidity, were able to acquire distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. This is the capture phase of the elite strategy, a recurring pattern seen in the 19th century railroad collapses and the post-Woodou restructuring of Europe under the Marshall Plan. It is a process of clearing the board of small players to make room for a new, more centralized order, often under the guise of stabilization or emergency measures. Deepening our narrative dive, we look at the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, which established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by gold. For a time, this created a semblance of order, but as the costs of empire and social programs grew, the US began to issue more paper than the gold in its vaults could justify. This led to the pivotal Nixon shock of 1971, where the last link to a physical anchor was severed. This move was not a failure of strategy, but a deliberate pivot by the global financial elite to move into a regime of pure fiat, allowing for an unprecedented expansion of debt and influence. For 50 years, this system has allowed for the financialization of every aspect of human life, creating a world where the derivatives market is now many times larger than the entire global GDP. We must understand that the people who built this system are fully aware of its terminal nature. They have spent the last half-century extracting the maximum possible value from the fiat experiment, and they are now preparing to move the remaining equity into a new, more restrictive system before the old one is allowed to burn out. The mechanism behind this strategy is a complex interplay of debt, interest rates, and liquidity cycles. In a fiat-based economy, money is created as debt, meaning that for every dollar in circulation, there's a corresponding debt plus interest. This creates a mathematical certainty. There will never be enough money in existence to pay off all of the debt. Therefore, the system requires constant growth and constant new debt to prevent a total deflationary collapse. The elite strategy involves managing the pace of this expansion. When the elite want to consolidate assets, they allow interest rates to rise, which vacuums the liquidity out of the system. This triggers a wave of defaults among the most leveraged players, usually small businesses and the middle class. Once the prices of real estate, stocks, and commodities have crashed, the central banks lower rates again and engage in quantitative easing, providing the ultra-wealthy with the cheap capital needed to buy up the world's remaining productive assets. This is the whale and minnow dynamic, where the system is designed to periodically swallow the small to feed the large. Today, we see these exact historical forces repeating with a terrifying symmetry. The global debt to GDP ratio has surpassed 300%, a level that has historically preceded either a violent revolution or a total currency reset. Just as the central banks of the 1920s ignored the warning signs of a bubble, the modern Federal Reserve and European Central Bank have spent the last decade creating a everything bubble through zero interest rate policies and trillions in stimulus. Now, they are aggressively raising rates into a slowing economy, the classic liquidity vacuum move. We see the same fragmentation of global trade that occurred before the Great Depression, as nations retreat into hostile blocs and the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions triggers a global search for alternatives. The elite strategy is now visible in the move towards central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which will offer the architects a level of granular control over individual spending and saving that would have been unimaginable to the bankers of 1907. The hidden forces and power structures behind this transition are not clandestine groups operating in the shadows, but highly visible institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Economic Forum, WEF. These organizations provide the intellectual and policy framework for the coming crash. For example, the BIS, the Bank for Central Banks, has been increasingly vocal about the need for a unified ledger and the end of cash. This is not about efficiency, it is about programmable money that can be turned off or depreciated at the click of a button. The elite incentive here is the elimination of the bank run. In a digital, centralized system, there is no exit from the banking system. You cannot withdraw your wealth into a physical form to wait out a crisis. This ensures that the population is permanently tethered to the institutional ledger, making the next wealth transfer far more efficient and complete than any that have come before. The acceleration of this transition is driven by a phenomenon that economists call the Cantillon effect, a structural reality where the entities closest to the source of new money, the central banks and Tier 1 financial institutions, benefit at the direct expense of the general public. When a central bank injects trillions into the financial system, that new capital does not flow evenly. Instead, it is utilized by the elite to purchase assets, real estate, commodities, and equities, well before the resulting inflation hits the consumer market. By the time this new money reaches the hands of the middle class, its purchasing power has already been diluted. This effectively functions as a regressive tax, vacuuming the value out of personal savings and transferring it into the balance sheets of the institutional architects. As the current fiat system reaches its terminal stage, we are witnessing the implementation of a liquidity trap on a global scale. In previous cycles, as seen during the 1920s and the 2008 Great Recession, the collapse of a credit bubble led to a mass liquidation of assets. However, the modern strategy is more sophisticated. Rather than a total crash, the elite are managing a controlled burn of the dollar's value. By maintaining high interest rates while simultaneously providing massive backstop facilities for major banks, they are squeezing the smaller players out of the market. This creates a vacuum phase, where small and mid-sized banks are absorbed by too big to fail institutions, centralizing the world's remaining wealth into fewer and fewer hands. The narrative deep dive takes us into the asset-based surveillance model. As physical ownership of property becomes increasingly unattainable for the average citizen, the elite strategy pivots toward a subscription-based economy. Institutional investors like BlackRock and Vanguard are not just buying stocks, they are moving into essential life infrastructure, everything from residential neighborhoods to water rights and energy grids. The goal is to transform the world's productive population into a permanent tenant class. In this model, your wealth is no longer something you own, but something you are permitted to use, contingent upon your standing within a centralized digital system. Parallel to this is the rapid development of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. Unlike the digital money we use today, which is a liability of a commercial bank, a CBDC is a direct liability of the central bank. This gives the elite the ultimate strategic tool, programmable money. This is not a conspiracy, it is a documented policy goal found in reports from the BIS and the IMF. Programmable money allows for targeted devaluation, where specific funds can be restricted to certain types of purchases or even given an expiration date to force a velocity into a stagnant economy. This removes the final exit for the individual, the ability to save, the historical precedent. For this type of reset can be found in the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement and the subsequent 1971 Nixon shock. In both cases, the rules of the global economy were rewritten overnight to preserve the power of the creditor class, while the public was told these were temporary stabilization measures. We are now at the threshold of a Bretton Woods III. This new regime will likely involve the introduction of a new global reserve asset, potentially a basket of commodities or a digital SDR, effectively defaulting on the current dollar-denominated debt while preserving the elite's claim on the world as physical assets. The acceleration phase is marked by the weaponization of the emergency narrative. Throughout the 20th century, major economic shifts have always been preceded by a period of crisis. Wars, pandemics, or energy shortages. These events provide the political cover, necessary to pass radical economic policies that would be rejected during times of peace. The elite strategy involves using these periods of high social volatility to implement the technological and legal infrastructure for the new system, such as mandatory digital identities and carbon-linked financial tracking. The climax of this script reveals that Pernarnier is the big truth. The coming crash is not a bug in the system, but the intended clearance sale. For those who understand the cycle, the destruction of the old currency is merely a necessary step to clear the way for a new, more efficient form of control. The elite are not trying to save the current economy, they are managing its expiration. They are moving out of promises to pay, cash and bonds, and into things that exist, land, energy, and technology. The ending of this documentary is a call to historical grounding. We are living through the end of a 50-year fiat experiment. The strategy for the elite has always been to be the one who owns the ledger when the game restarts. As the volatility increases, the most important asset you have is not a digital number on a screen, but your understanding of the pattern itself. History shows us that when the rules of money change, the structure of society follows. The crash is inevitable, but the outcome is being written right now by those who have positioned themselves to inherit the ruins. The strategic move into real-world assets, RWA, is currently being accelerated by the tokenization of the physical world. While the public is distracted by the volatility of speculative digital tokens, the institutional elite are building the rails to move the entire global inventory of property, land, gold, energy, and water onto a private, blockchain-based ledger. This is the digital enclosure, a modern version of the 18th century enclosure acts in England. By digitizing the ownership of physical reality, the elite can ensure that as the paper currency burns, their claim on the earth itself remains immutable. This allows for a seamless transition where the old debt is vaporized, but the assets remain firmly in the hands of the creditor class. We must also analyze the controlled volatility of the energy sector. Historically, every major economic reset has been preceded or accompanied by an energy crisis. From the 1973 oil shock to the current restructuring of global gas flows, energy is the ultimate lever of social control. The elite strategy involves a transition to a green energy grid that is inherently more centralized and easier to monitor than the decentralized fossil fuel systems of the past. By tying financial access to carbon footprints and energy consumption, the new monetary system creates a resource gatekeeper model. In this world, the ability to transact is no longer just about having currency. It is about having the carbon permission to spend it. The psychological priming of the population is perhaps the most critical component of the strategy. Through a process known as social engineering, the public is conditioned to accept a lower standard of living under the guise of sustainability or emergency response. We see this in the normalization of the sharing economy, where ownership is framed as a burden and subscription is framed as freedom. This psychological shift ensures that when the middle class is finally liquidated of their assets during the crash, they do not revolt but rather accept their new status as digital serfs, within a system that provides for their basic needs in exchange for total behavioral compliance. Furthermore, the consolidation of information is reaching its terminal point. In the 1920s, the elite controlled the narrative through a handful of newspapers and radio stations. Today, that control is exercised through the algorithmic curation of reality. By managing the flow of economic data and alternative truths, the architects ensure that the public remains divided and distracted. This prevents the formation of a unified resistance to the monetary reset. As the crash nears, the signal-to-noise ratio will become intentionally distorted, making it nearly impossible for the average person to distinguish between a market correction and a permanent systemic shift until the gates are already closed. The offshore liquidity shield remains the ultimate insurance policy for the architects. While the domestic middle class is trapped within the regulatory and tax walls of their home nations, the elite operate through a parallel financial system of offshore trusts, sovereign wealth funds, and private jurisdictions. This creates a one-way mirror of wealth. The state can see and tax the wealth of the citizen, but the citizen cannot see or touch the wealth of the elite. As the global debt bubble bursts, this offshore capital will be the seed corn used to buy up the devalued remains of the domestic economy, completing the cycle of extraction that began 50 years ago. We are also witnessing the automation of the judiciary. In the new economic paradigm, enforcement of contracts and the collection of debt will no longer be subject to the slow human processes of a courtroom. Through smart contracts and AI-driven legal systems, the liquidation of assets during the crash can be handled automatically. If a person's social or financial score falls below a certain threshold, their access to housing, transportation, or even their own currency can be restricted instantly. This removes the human friction that historically slowed down the collapse of empires, allowing for a hyper-efficient transition into the new order. The geopolitical realignment is the final external stage of the strategy. The elite are currently managing the managed declines of the West, while simultaneously building the infrastructure for a multipolar world. This involves the strategic transfer of technology and manufacturing capacity to the East, creating a new set of global managers. The coming crash will be used to dissolve the old alliances of the 20th century, replacing them with a global governance model based on technical and financial standards rather than national sovereignty. This ensures that no matter which nation wins the next conflict, the global financial architecture remains under the same management. The final revelation of the elite strategy is the understanding that crisis is an industry. To the architects, a crash is not a disaster, it is a rebalancing event. They have spent decades building the tools to profit from the decline. From credit default swaps to short selling the very currencies they manage, the elite are long on chaos and short on stability. The coming crash is the ultimate payout for this strategy. As the old world dissolves, they do not see a loss of value. They see the final acquisition of the planet's remaining resources. The strategy is not to prevent the fire, but to own the company that sells the water and the company that rebuilds the city when the smoke clears. As the strategy enters its final operational phase, we observe the institutionalization of the secondary market. During the initial shock of the coming crash, asset prices will detach from their intrinsic value as forced liquidations create a vacuum of buyers. The elite strategy involves the deployment of dry powder, trillions in sidelined capital held by private equity and sovereign wealth funds, to provide a floor for the market only after the retail and middle-class investors have been wiped out. This is a deliberate reset of ownership, where the productive assets of a nation are transferred from a broad base of citizens to a narrow base of institutional managers. This ensures that the recovery phase of the cycle does not benefit the public, but rather serves to compound the wealth of the entities that provided the stow-emergency liquidity during the height of the panic. We must also confront the consolidation of the global food supply. Control over currency is powerful, but control over caloric intake is absolute. In recent years, we have seen an unprecedented acquisition of prime agricultural land by billionaire individuals and institutional funds. This is a move toward vertical integration of the human existence. When the financial system crashes, the value of paper money may vanish, but the necessity of food remains constant. By controlling the production and distribution of food, the elite create a hard asset moat that protects their power regardless of the state of the banking system. This is the reemergence of the physiocratic model of economics, where land is recognized as the only true source of wealth, and those who own it become the de facto governors of the new era. The digital ID and financial linking phase is the mechanical lock on the new system. Throughout the 2020s, the infrastructure for a global digital identity has been quietly integrated into health, travel, and social platforms. The elite strategy is to merge this identity with the new central bank digital currencies. This creates a unified social credit ledger where economic participation is no longer a right but a revocable privilege. In the event of a crash, the bail-ins and wealth taxes necessary to stabilize the system will be executed with surgical precision at the individual level. There will be no need for mass legislation when the ledger itself can be programmed to adjust the balances of the population according to the needs of the state. Furthermore, we are witnessing the strategic managed scarcity of essential commodities. From rare earth minerals required for high-tech infrastructure to the energy required to power data centers, the elite have moved to secure the points of choke in the global supply chain. By creating a world of perpetual shortages, they can drive up the value of their holdings while simultaneously justifying the implementation of rationing systems for the general public. This rationing will likely be managed through the new digital currency platforms, allowing for a level of microeconomic control that makes the planned economies of the 20th century look primitive. The crash provides the necessary crisis to move the public from a world of abundance into a world of allocated access. The scientific and technocratic governance model is the intellectual justification for the new order. As the old political structures fail to manage the chaos of the crash, the elite will present expert-led management as the only viable solution. This is the move away from representative democracy toward technocracy, where decisions are made based on algorithmic efficiency and systemic stability, rather than the will of the people. The crash will be framed as a failure of human greed and unregulated markets, providing the perfect pretext for the installation of an automated AI-driven economic system that prioritizes the survival of the structure over the freedom of the individual. The intergenerational transfer of liability is the final financial mechanism. The elite have successfully structured the modern economy so that the debts of the present are the liabilities of the future. By inflating the cost of education and housing while suppressing real wages, they have effectively poorly mortgaged the lives of future generations to pay for the expansion of the current financial bubble. When the crash occurs, the restructuring will ensure that the elite AS assets are protected while the public AS debts are reorganized into long-term servitude to the state. This creates a permanent class of debt tenants who will spend their entire lives paying interest to the institutions that inherited the world during the reset. The not climax of the strategy is the realization that the elite are not preparing for a new world order in the distant future. They are currently living in it. The crash is simply the formal unveiling of a reality that has already been constructed. The institutions, the technology, and the asset transfers are all in place. The event itself is merely the catalyst required to move the population across the threshold. Those who are waiting for a return to the normalcy of the late 20th century are looking at a world that no longer exists. The elite have already abandoned the old ship. They are simply waiting for the final wave to sink it before they reveal the new vessel they have been building in the docks of the shadow economy. As we conclude this exploration of the elite strategy, we must understand that history is a series of closed loops. Every great empire has used a crisis to centralize power, and every currency reset has favored the creditors over the debtors. The coming crash is the completion of a cycle that began when money was first detached from reality. The elite strategy is not to stop the inevitable, but to master the aftermath. In a world of total financial transparency and digital control, the only true wealth that remains is the knowledge of the system itself. The pattern has returned, the strategy is active, and the final moves are being made. The question is no longer what they will do, but what you will do with the truth of the strategy.